Have you ever found yourself maybe watching the news, just watching this sort of dizzying push and pull of power,
Yeah.
the seemingly endless chaos of political life?
Oh, absolutely.
And you just wonder, isn't there some deeper pattern? Maybe something cyclical going on,
Yeah, you look for the rhythm in it, don't you?
right? That universal human desire for order, for things to be stable, just constantly crashing against the messy, sometimes brutal reality of how things actually get run. If you've ever just craved one of those aha moments, something that cuts through all the noise and helps you really get the forces shaping our world, well, you're definitely in the right place.
Indeed. It's that feeling, isn't it? Trying to make sense of it all. Whether it's ancient history, stuff happening right now, or even just the power dynamics in our own communities.
Yeah.
We instinctively look for patterns, for these sort of underlying truths about leadership, ambition, and just how humans interact when politics is involved.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. We take all this information, you give us articles, research, our own notes, and we boil it down, distill it into the most potent insights.
Cutting through the noise.
Exactly, giving you those aha moments that really make knowledge stick.
And today, we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive. We're looking into popular Chinese political thought, and we're drawing from a truly rich academic paper by Peter R. Moody, Jr. He's a scholar whose insights are, well, they're rigorous, but also incredibly accessible.
Our mission today is to explore how these ancient ideas, especially as they're reflected so vividly in one of China's most beloved classic novels, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms.
A cornerstone text, really.
Absolutely. How these ideas offer a surprisingly potent and sometimes, let's be honest, unsettling lens to understand not just Chinese politics, but maybe the very nature of power, morality, and chaos across all human societies.
Yeah.
We're going to try and unpack what it means to lead when the world is just in utter disarray, when the usual moral compass seems to be spinning wildly.
And whether morality even has a fighting chance when, as the paper puts it so well, clubs are trumps, when force is what matters.
Right, those might make right in those situations.
This isn't just a history lesson, though, or some dry academic exercise. It's really a journey into ideas that resonate, I think, deeply with anyone trying to understand those enduring tensions in political culture.
Those impossible choices leaders face in a crisis.
Exactly. And that perennial, often agonizing question, can good intentions ever actually triumph over brutal expediency?
Get ready to maybe reconsider everything you thought you knew about heroes and villains in politics, and how our own view on political actions is shaped by, well, the conditions we find ourselves in.
Okay, let's dive in.
All right, let's unpack this. We're starting with a really foundational concept in Chinese political culture, something scholars have dug into for decades. Peter Moody's paper immediately brings us to this idea of the authority crisis, as studied by prominent scholars like Lucien Pai and Richard Solomon.
Right, Pai and Solomon. They really stress this concept of Chinese political culture, often analyzing it through the lens of this perceived crisis of authority.
Yeah.
Solomon, especially, he goes into great detail. He argues that harmony and peace are basic and enduring political values in the Confucian tradition. Which sounds great, right? Harmony, peace.
I wouldn't want that.
Exactly. But this immediately sets up a core tension, because while everyone wants harmony, he says, questions of the handling of social conflict constitute a major area of tension in the Chinese political culture.
So how do you get that peace when people inevitably have different interests, different goals, and when the very things you do to create order might actually cause more problems?
Precisely.
So the argument, based on this scholarly view, is that the Chinese people have this deep-seated yearning for order, a belief that real stability only comes through strong, centralized authority.
Strong leadership.
And without that kind of firm hand, what you get is luan, which is the Chinese word for chaos, right? Disorder, anarchy, even rebellion.
Yeah, Luan. It's a powerful concept.
It seems like a pretty straightforward equation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Strong leader equals order, weak or no leader equals chaos. Almost like a formula for your view on political necessity.
But here's the paradox, and it's a really crucial one that drives so much of the political thought we're going to discuss.
Okay.
The very means you need to exercise that strong authority. Well, they often create resentment. Think about it. A heavy hand coming down, even if the intention is peace.
People don't like being pushed around.
Exactly. Even if, from the top, it's seen as being for their own good or for stability. And this simmering resentment then becomes the fuel for more luan, more chaos, maybe uprisings, fragmentation.
So it's a cycle.
It can be. A self-perpetuating cycle. A deep-seated tension where that human desire for stability clashes head-on with the human reaction to having power imposed on them.
That dynamic, identified so clearly in ancient China, it really does reflect broader human tendencies in how we govern ourselves, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it.
Yes.
In a crisis, we often want strong leadership, right? Someone decisive, someone to take charge, cut through the confusion.
Yeah, do something.
But then, almost immediately, once that leadership is established, it gets pushed back. Resistance, criticism, sometimes outright rebellion. It's like a constant tightrope walk for anyone in charge. We want order, we want security, but we also value our autonomy, our freedom. And those two things are often pulling in opposite directions.
You see it everywhere. National politics, corporate boardrooms.
Yeah, calls for strong executive action versus wanting more collaboration. It's a core tension in pretty much any political system, isn't it?
It really is. It's like a spring constantly being compressed and then wanting to expand, or a pendulum swinging back and forth.
The more you push, the harder it pushes back eventually.
Right. And this dynamic isn't just Chinese. It's a universal pattern of how societies respond to authority and how they create it. It deeply impacts how we view political leadership and, what its legitimate scope should be.
But then Peter Moody comes in, and he offers a really important challenge to this kind of established political culture interpretation.
Okay.
While he acknowledges, the initial insights, he argues that focusing too rigidly on it can sometimes lead to, I think his words were, irrelevance and even fatuity.
Fatuity, yeah. Basically, it can become a bit meaningless or silly if you take it too far.
He's suggesting that maybe sometimes focusing too much on these deep-seated, often generalized cultural psychology ideas makes us miss the more straightforward, practical, rational reasons for why people act and think the way they do politically.
His first example of this critique is quite striking, and it comes from Solomon's analysis. Solomon had this hypothesis that totalitarianism, by supposedly destroying the traditional authoritarian family structure in China.
Right, the idea that the family was like a training ground for obedience.
Kind of. And Solomon thought that by breaking that down, totalitarianism would somehow create generations who were free of political submissiveness.
So they wouldn't obey the state anymore.
That was the idea. That the state, by weakening the family, would effectively be digging its own grave. The implication was that these fundamental psychological shifts, starting in the family, would automatically lead to political rebellion or rejecting state authority.
And Moody is skeptical of this.
Very skeptical. He questions whether psychological change necessarily has such a direct, predictable political impact. He points out, interestingly, that both Confucius, who championed the family,
as the cornerstone of society.
Right, and Plato, who sometimes argued for more state control over family life, both understood that the family can actually act as a crucial counterweight to state power.
So maybe a strong family resists the state more.
Perhaps. Moody suggests that, counterintuitively, a truly authoritarian family, with its deep loyalties and strong internal rules, might actually be a stronger barrier to total state control than a looser, more individualistic one.
Huh.
That's interesting.
And furthermore, Moody notes a crucial timing issue. The totalitarian state in China really took shape after the decay of traditional family authority had already begun in many politically active groups, not before.
So the cause and effect might be reversed?
Sure.
Or just not connected like that?
Exactly. Or other factors were way more important. He calls this a fallacy of composition, a logical error, where you assume that what's true for a part, like individual psychology, must be true for the whole political system. You can't just assume changing attitudes automatically makes a system crumble predictably.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second example?
His second example comes from those comparative political studies by Ullman and Verba. They famously found low levels of political efficacy in Italians back then.
Meaning they felt like they couldn't influence their government much.
Right, compared to high efficacy in Americans. And this was widely interpreted as a fundamental cultural difference. Like, it was just part of Italian political culture to feel powerless.
But Moody pushes back on that too. He does, and his counter-argument is so simple, but really sharp. He says, look, maybe these attitudes are just rational responses to concrete political situations.
So not culture, but reality.
Oh, yeah. If Americans, particularly in the 1950s when the study was done, could actually influence their government through voting, lobbying, community action, etc., and Italians at that time largely couldn't because their system was maybe more rigid or less responsive.
Then it's not a cultural trait, it's just them reporting the facts of their lives.
Precisely. It's not some cultural defect. It's a realistic assessment of their political environment. They felt they couldn't influence things because, well, they couldn't.
Wow. That really challenges you to look beyond those broad cultural stereotypes, doesn't it?
It forces you to think about your own cultural attitudes towards authority or how much you feel you can influence the system. Are those feelings based on some deep cultural programming, or are they actually shaped by your real-world experiences?
If you've lived where your voice matters, you probably believe in efficacy. If not,
Your attitude might logically reflect that reality. It's not necessarily a psychological trait. It's learned experience. And that profoundly impacts your view on whether political participation is even worth it.
So Moody reframes this whole thing. He argues that the deep longing for harmony, that visceral fear of Luan chaos,
Yeah.
it isn't just some abstract cultural attitude or a convenience psychological diagnosis.
Right.
Instead, he says it's natural enough in people who have known little harmony and much Luan all their lives.
Right.
It's a rational, understandable response to generations of suffering, instability, lack of order.
It's not a flaw, it's a consequence.
Exactly. A coping mechanism, an aspiration born from really harsh experience.
And this leads to his core shift in perspective. Moody proposes we look at these popular Chinese attitudes not as, like, psychological symptoms to be diagnosed.
Like the culture is the patient.
Yeah, exactly. But as political theory, worthy of analysis in its own right, especially under conditions of extreme Luan, where traditional moral rules seem to just stop working.
Or the social fabric unravels.
Right. In that kind of environment, the harsh reality is often that force can be met only with stronger force. Restraint may be fatal. Your traditional ethics might not just be insufficient, they might actually get you killed.
So what does that actually mean for a society then? When basic self-preservation seems to demand you throw out the old moral rule book. When the choice isn't really between good and evil anymore, but maybe just between survival and annihilation, we see echoes of this all over, don't we? Civil wars, post-apocalyptic stories.
Even certain modern crises where the rules seem to bend or break under extreme pressure.
Yeah. When survival is paramount, does morality just become a luxury? Something you can't afford. It must completely reorient your view on political action and its limits.
And that's precisely the lens through which we now need to look at The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, because this novel, it's not just a story, it becomes a profound exploration of these exact questions.
Okay, let's talk about this literary masterpiece, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or Sanquayeni. Moody presents it as the paradigmatic case of popular political thought for this deep dive.
And you really see why. It's central to understanding the popular Chinese view on political events and morality.
It's this huge, sweeping, epic novel, right? Telling the story of one of the most chaotic periods in Chinese history.
The 3rd century AD, specifically around 220 to 264 AD. It's right after the collapse of the Great Han Dynasty.
And what's fascinating is that the novel itself was written much later, during another really chaotic time.
Yeah, the late 14th century, end of the Yuan dynasty, beginning of the Ming. So the author, Lok Chumteavs, was looking back at one period of Luan from inside another one. That must have given it incredible resonance.
And its influence is just massive. The paper calls it perhaps the most widely known and influential of all the traditional Chinese novels.
It really is. It's the source for countless plays, operas, folk tales, cultural references. Even modern video games and movies draw heavily on it.
It's not just a book. It's woven into the popular consciousness, shaping how people see heroes, villains, loyalty, strategy for centuries.
And its origin is fascinating, too. It draws from both the official court history, the Sanquchi, the records of the Three Kingdoms, and from this rich tradition of popular storytellers' prompt books.
So it's a blend of fact and fiction, history, and heroic tales.
Exactly. Factual accounts mixed with imaginative embellishments, dramatic dialogues, the stuff that really captured the popular imagination. And while it's written in a more literary style, not pure vernacular, the characters, even if they start as archetypes.
Like the loyal general, the cunning strategist.
Right. They're given enough depth to become complex, relatable, enduring figures.
So the question then is, why use fiction, even if it's based on history, to understand political thought?
Moody argues that even though it's often called 7 parts history and 3 parts fiction, it's invaluable for understanding popular political attitudes precisely because it is political in its conception.
It's not just telling a story, it's making a statement about power.
It's a profound commentary on power, governance, the human condition within politics. It explores those deep questions. How do societies fall apart? And maybe, how can they be put back together?
And the central themes are crucial for our deep dive. One is the nature of human ambition.
That relentless drive for power, recognition, legacy.
And maybe even more profound, the relationship between politics and morality, which, as the paper says, is arguably the central problem in politics.
Can you be moral and effective in that brutal arena? Do good intentions lead to hell or to a better world? That's where the novel just gets incredibly powerful.
Okay, so let's briefly sketch the plot because it sets the stage. It's about the breakup of the Han Dynasty, which ruled for centuries.
Then its division into 3 separate warring kingdoms: Wei in the north, Wu in the south along the Yanks, and Shu in the west in Sichuan.
And then the eventual, though temporary, reunification under a new dynasty, the Qin.
And it's important to note, the author, Lok Chumteavs, he takes a clear moral stance, just like the storytellers did. He portrays Shu, led by Liu Pei, as the righteous, legitimate continuation of the Han.
While Wei and Wu are seen as illegitimate usurpers.
Right. That sets a moral compass right from the start, guiding how you, the reader, are supposed to feel.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and this is a crucial key to understanding this whole deep dive. The opening sentence of the novel.
Ah, yes, the famous opening line.
Is one of the best-known lines in all of Chinese literature, kind of a foundational saying for the whole story. And it's repeated at the very end, too, right?
Frames the whole thing, reinforces the core message.
The common translation, the one you often hear, is something like, empires wax and wane, states cleave asunder and coalesce, suggests a natural rhythm.
But Moody gives us a more literal and I think much more revealing translation. It emphasizes this really profound concept. The great Shi, under heaven, having been long divided, must unite. Having been long united, must divide.
Shi. That word is the linchpin, isn't it?
Absolutely, sure. It's key. And it's tricky for Westerners because we don't really have one single word for it in English.
Right, it's complex. It combines ideas like power, authority, influence.
But also more passive things like circumstances, situation, position, condition.
It's like the lay of the land, the way things are trending.
Kind of. In ancient legalist philosophy, which was often very pragmatic, even ruthless, they believed, effective rule depended almost entirely on shi, on the strategic situation, the leverage you had, not necessarily on the ruler being a good person.
So if you had this shi, you could rule effectively, regardless of your morals.
That was the legalist view, yeah. It bridges that gap between actively using power and passively recognizing the circumstances you're in. You feel the opportunism in it, but also the sense of inevitability.
Like that yellow turban rebel leader quote.
Exactly. He tells his brother, if we do not ride the shi and seize all under heaven, it would really be a pity. He's saying, the moment's right, circumstances favor us, we have to act.
It's a very pragmatic, almost amoral view on political opportunity.
Moody even compares it to B.F. Skinner's behavioralism, where behavior depends on the environment.
Yeah.
A legalist might just say, his behavior depends upon the shi. It's like an environmental determinism for politics.
For simplicity, Moody suggests maybe forces is the easiest, though imperfect way to translate shi, the great forces under heaven.
Right. Which brings us to the core philosophical idea running through the romance. The cyclical theory of history. These great forces shaping events, they move back and forth.
From qi, which is order, good government.
To luan, chaos, anarchy, and then back again. It's not just observed history. It's presented as this deterministic, almost cosmic system. The nature of power itself is cyclical.
And this was deeply embedded in Chinese cosmology, wasn't it? Like Tung Chung-shu and the early Han systematizing it.
Yes, this idea of a great cycle of being governing everything. Yang becomes yin, the 5 elements follow cycles, wood generates fire, fire generates earth, and so on. It's comprehensive.
And the political world mirrors this cosmic order.
That was the belief. Remember the yellow turban propaganda? The azure sky has died. The yellow sky is taking its place. Azure for the Han, yellow for the next phase in the cycle.
So even natural disasters weren't random, they were signs?
Portents, warnings, punishments. A direct link between the macrocosm, the universe, and the microcosm, human society and politics.
So if the cosmic shi says order must eventually turn to chaos, when the world falls into Luan, human behavior just reflects that chaos.
It becomes harder to stick to the rules. It's easy to be ethical when things are stable, predictable. But in chaos, when the law breaks down, survival is key. Morality often becomes increasingly inexpedient.
The legalist, like Skinner, would say ethics just depends on the situation, the she.
Pretty much. If the situation demands ruthlessness, that's what you'll get, regardless of old moral codes.
But this is where Lok Chumteavs, the author, and Confucian thought, which is so strong in the novel, diverge from that purely deterministic view.
Exactly. Here's the crucial nuance. While the system as a whole is deterministic, order leads to chaos. Chaos leads to order, like a giant wheel turning. It's profoundly not deterministic in its parts. People, in this view, retain a certain moral autonomy.
So even if villainy works in chaos, it's still wrong.
Right. Villainy might become expedient, it might even bring success, but right remains right and wrong remains wrong. The novel doesn't just shrug and say, well, that's what works.
So the chaos itself, while part of the cycle, isn't just impersonal. It comes from human choices.
Yes, it arises from the free choices of men working at cross purposes. Even if the cycle is inevitable, the individuals who let things decay, who choose self-interest, who perpetuate violence, they still bear moral blame.
Like that saying, it is inevitable that trouble come, but woe to the man through whom it comes.
Precisely. So the central moral problem for Lok Chumteavs is incredibly profound. It's about behavior in a world where moral principles retain their moral validity but have lost their practical efficacy.
How do you act virtuously when virtue seems to lead only to failure? That's a massive question.
It is, and it speaks right to the core dilemmas of leadership in crisis and the difficult view you have to take on political action in a fallen world. This tension sets the stage for all the dramatic moral and political struggles in the novel.
Which brings us right to one of the most agonizing dilemmas in the book, the impossible tangle of loyalty, Chung.
Ah, Chung, loyalty.
In Orthodox Confucian thought, loyalty to your ruler, your dynasty, it's supposed to be absolute right. It doesn't depend on whether the ruler is good or bad, capable or incompetent.
Once you've committed, you're committed. Now, that doesn't mean blind obedience. A loyal minister might have to argue strongly against a bad ruler or even quit if their advice is ignored.
But you never betray them, never help their enemy.
Never. It's an unwavering commitment.
And Lok Chumteavs, the author, he really sympathizes with this noble, almost tragic idea. But he implies a painful truth, that this nobility is its own and only reward.
Yeah, the virtuous characters, like Liu Pei, they often fail precisely because they stick to their virtue, or their success is fleeting.
While the wicked ones, like Cao Cao, don't necessarily fail because they're wicked. In fact, their ruthlessness often helps them win.
It often leads to material success, consolidation of power, yeah.
And the crux is, when those great forces are so divided, when the dynasty has shattered, traditional singular loyalty becomes objectively impossible.
The concept itself, that rigid Confucian ideal, it becomes a hindrance, a moral knot you can't untie.
And the classic, heartbreaking example is Quan Kung, revered even today as the god of loyalty.
The ultimate paragon of fidelity, Quan Kung. And he faces this excruciating dilemma. At one point, he has Cao Cao, the main villain, completely cornered.
Warong Pass.
Poised to deliver a potentially decisive blow. Destroying Cao Cao there could have secured Liu Pei's victory and maybe ended the chaos years earlier. But Cao Cao had once shown Quan Kung this profound act of ungrace, kindness. He released him from captivity, treated him with respect.
So Quan Kung feels obligated.
He feels honor-bound to repay this personal debt, this N. So even though he's loyal to Liu Pei and the Han cause, he lets Cao Cao escape.
Which means his own leader, Liu Pei, loses a massive advantage. The war drags on, more suffering.
Exactly. As Moody's paper says, loyalty in chaos becomes a knot of multiple loyalties, a knot that easily becomes an impossible tangle. It's not just loyalty versus loyalty, but often Chung, political loyalty versus I, personal honor.
Which leads us to I and N as maybe the only ethics that can work in total disorder?
Perhaps. Here isn't just righteousness in general, but more like honor or brotherhood between sworn friends. N is that grace bestowed by a superior, creating this deep personal obligation.
It sounds a bit like, well, the paper mentions Samengwu's analysis of water margin and gangster ethics.
Yeah, Lu Mang ethics or feudal ethics. The intense bond of I between friends contrasted with the formal gentry ethics of Chung to ruler and Cao to parents.
And the Peach Garden Oath Liu Pei, Quan Kung, Chang Fei swearing brotherhood. Though we were not born on the same day, we wished to die on the same day.
That's presented as the idealized version of this gangster ethics. It's based not on formal politics, but on profound personal bonds. Maybe in chaos, when institutions fail, that's the only ethical system that holds, the only glue.
But even that idealized brotherhood doesn't guarantee success on a larger scale, does it? It highlights how collective action just breaks down in chaos.
Yeah, the Peach Garden Bond is the ideal, but other alliances in the novel just constantly fall apart. Greed, suspicion, short-term thinking.
Like that alliance against Tung Shou early on. All the generals get together, swear oaths.
But it's extremely uncohesive, a total mess. Yuan Shu sabotages Sun Chen by withholding supplies.
Lets him twist in the wind.
Then Sun Chen finds that old imperial seal, a symbol of legitimacy, and immediately quits the fight to go dream about starting his own dynasty.
So instead of fighting the common enemy, they're squabbling over loot, nursing grudges, can't even coordinate in battle.
They just drift apart. The grand goal dissolves in petty self-interest.
It's that classic warlord politics pattern Lucian Pai talks about. Alliances based on personal ties and short-term expediency, not shared vision or loyalty to an institution. And you have to ask, does that sound familiar? Modern political coalitions trying to pass one bill. Business partnerships where self-interest derails the bigger goal.
When the goal is order for everyone, but individuals are always calculating their own angle, looking for ways to get ahead, it just fuels the chaos. Trust evaporates.
Which brings us to the fundamental conflict, maybe the most compelling part of the novel's view on political agency. That clash between Liu Pei and Cao Cao.
Archetypes.
The novel argues people aren't just puppets of Xie. They're not robots driven by circumstance. They can choose virtue over expediency. But if they do, especially in chaos, they will come to grief. That's the core tension. Virtue, ordinary decency, kindness, sticking to morals, like Liu Pei versus Machiavellian virtue.
Which isn't moral virtue, but skill, ruthless effectiveness, boldness, cunning, embodied by Cao Cao.
Liu Pei, the virtuous idealist. He's often described as almost wishy-washy, even colorless.
Yet paradoxically, that's presented as a virtue in the Confucian ideal. The decent, gentle, kind ruler whose integrity attracts brilliant people who do the actual work. His colorlessness is part of his gentleness.
Though honestly, as a character, he can be a bit of a crybaby, right? Using tears to handle crises.
Yeah, the novel sometimes asks us to just accept his greatness and why people love him by convention rather than always fully showing us.
And this very decency is his tragic flaw in chaos. He's too decent a man to rule in an age of chaos. He will not taint his soul with the necessary ruthlessness.
Even though he is ambitious. Played emperor as a kid, wants to destroy the thieves and bring peace. Greatness is also kind of thrust upon him, duty to the Han, being an imperial relative.
And his failures often come from sticking to morals when it's strategically dumb, like attacking Wu to avenge Quan Kung against all advice.
There's that pivotal scene, though, that shows the agonizing cost, his shifting view. His advisor, Pan Tong, urges him to invade Shu, a pragmatic move.
But Liu Pei resists at first.
Yeah, he says, Cao Cao and I are like fire and water. Cao is violent, I am gentle. Cao is deceitful, I am loyal. If I remain the opposite of Cao, we can succeed. I can't violate faith and righteousness for petty expediency. He wants to win by being good.
And Pan Tong's response.
Brutal pragmatism. Military force isn't everything except in a time of chaos. Stick to eternal principles now, you'll never advance. You have to be practical. Annex the weak, attack the deluded. This is the way of the ancient sage kings Tang and Wu. If we don't seize the day, someone else will seize us. Basically, in chaos, what works becomes the way.
And Liu Pei.
He's described as confused, torn. But after Chuko Liang, his top strategist, agrees with Pan Tong, Liu Pei reluctantly agrees to the invasion.
It's that crucial moment. The symbol of virtue realizes that to survive to fight Cao Cao, he has to act like Cao Cao.
His heart might be pure, but purity alone doesn't win in chaos. It's a tragic compromise. Maybe you have to dirty your hands for the greater good. It blurs the lines of political morality.
And then there's Cao Cao, the audacious villain, the ultimate Machiavel.
The ultimate in villainy, but, crucially, a villain in the grand style, often the most interesting, most entertaining character. His cunning, boldness, complexity.
Even as a kid, he was clever and tricky, right? Faking that fit.
Yeah, manipulative from the start. And he seems to relish his destiny. Remember Su Shao's prophecy. In a well-governed age, an able official. In a chaotic age, an audacious villain.
And Cao Cao's was greatly pleased by that.
Embraced it. His philosophy, that chilling story where he kills Li Poshi and his family out of suspicion.
Misinterprets them preparing food as a plot against it.
And then says, I would rather take advantage of everyone under heaven than let anyone under heaven take advantage of me. ruthless self-preservation as a political creed.
As a leader, he's competent, strong, ruthless, remorseless. Knows how to win loyalty when it suits him, can even show magnanimity if it serves a purpose.
But his defining trait is that chilling Machiavellianism, manipulating perceptions, exploiting situations with cold calculation.
The story of Wang Hao, the Buddha master, that's just terrifying.
Isn't it? Army needs rations cut. Troops complain. Cao Cao needs to stop a mutiny.
So he borrows Wang Hao's head.
Tells him straight up, I know you did nothing wrong, but unless I kill you, there'll be a mutiny. I'll look after your family. Then executes him and hangs up a sign calling him corrupt. Complaints stop.
It's brutal PR, calculated scapegoating.
And the other story, when Cao Cao himself tramples the grain, breaking his own strict law,
orders his own execution.
Publicly declares, I made the law, I violated it. Then an aide points out the ruler is exempt. So Cao, after some theatrical deep thought, cuts off his hair as a substitute for his head.
Brilliant manipulation. Shows he's strict, respects the law's spirit, even applies it to himself. Sort of.
It solidifies his image. These stories show his brutal pragmatism, his mastery of perception. He gets that in chaos. Impressions matter, maybe more than actual justice.
And he's hypocritical too, right? Claiming, I am heaven's agent.
Oh, blatantly. We're meant to see the hypocrisy. But here's the paradox of Cao Cao, a really challenging part for our view on political efficacy.
Okay.
Despite being the villain, the usurper, the traitor he is, in a weird way, heaven's agent in carrying out the way. Despite his immorality, where Cao has control, there he brings good government, order, and peace.
He actually stabilizes things, creates prosperity.
In his territories, yes. He's depicted as the only character really able and willing to do what is required to bring order and peace in that chaos. He does what the virtuous Lu Pei cannot or will not do.
That's a really difficult truth, isn't it? Forces you to question easy definitions of good and evil in politics.
Lu Pei might be the ideal ruler in peacetime, but in chaos, maybe you can only achieve the stable conditions for Lu Pei's gentle rule by using Cao's ruthless methods first.
Moody says we're often tempted to admire Cao Cao.
But he calls that admiration contemptible, an admiration for power divorced from moral considerations, admiring the evil that seems necessary for good.
The unsettling message. The road to Lu Pei is through Cao Cao. You need the bad guy to pave the way for the good guy.
And here's a thought building on that. Could the inverse be true too? That the amiable laxity of a good emperor in times of peace, maybe like the late Han emperors, too gentle, too slow, actually helps feed the growing chaos.
So the road to Cao Cao is through Lu Pei, good intentions leading to disorder.
It leads to this profound ambiguity as maybe the only appropriate response to authority. The qualities that make a leader good in one era might doom everyone in another.
So after all that, is there any escape from this cycle? Because ultimately, Cao Cao doesn't create a lasting dynasty either, does he?
No, he doesn't. The novel shows the cycle is inescapable. We see that final ironic turn.
With Sima, Cao Cao's own lieutenant.
Exactly. Sima Yi, cunning strategist, maneuvers his family into power, reduces the Cao rulers to puppets, just like Cao Cao did to the Han emperor.
And then his grandson, Sima Yan, finishes the job.
Deposes the last Cao ruler, establishes the Qin dynasty, brings the story full circle. Division leads to unity, as the opening line predicted.
But the novel ends with this really blatant hypocrisy, right? It's meant to be unsettling.
Deeply unsettling. Sima Yan formally removes Xiao Huan, the last Xiao emperor. Yan acts rudely, sits down first, questions his competence.
Cao Huan just gives up, basically admits the Sima family was the real power behind Wei.
And Yan justifies his usurpation with this incredible historical twist. This realm is the realm of the great Han. Cao Cao bullied the emperor. My ancestors supported Wei for 3 generations. The conquest wasn't due to the Caos, but to the might of the Sumas.
Implying his family were the true heroes all along.
And then a lone courtier cries out, if you do this, you'll be a usurper and a traitor to Wei.
And Sima Yan's reply.
Chilling. And what of it if I avenge the Han? As if that justifies everything.
But his family helped Cao Cao usurp the Han in the first place.
Exactly. It's transparent hypocrisy. Avenging the Han is just cynical political theater to grab power based purely on the might of the Sumas. No moral high ground, just brute force.
So within the novel's own ethics, Yan's disloyalty to the Caos is just as bad as Cao Cao's disloyalty to the Han.
Pretty much. Heaven, in its grand cycle, might approve the result reunification, but the Sumas get no moral credit. The only difference, the novel shows, is that the second is the more successful.
And Lok Chumteavs just records it, lets the hypocrisy speak for itself.
A powerful, silent commentary on power.
Okay, but despite all this bleakness, wickedness is the way out of chaos. Morality getting trampled the book isn't ultimately cynical.
Remarkably, no. Lok Chumteavs doesn't just say morality is expediency. He doesn't side with evil against good. His stance is fundamentally Confucian.
Good ends can sometimes be achieved only by evil means, but these means are not justified by the ends.
Right. The gentleman does what is right, not what is expedient, even if it's hard, even if it seems futile. The view on political action remains grounded in moral conviction despite the odds.
And this is where Lok Chumteavs finds his consolation, in being the historian and storyteller.
Yes. He uses his narrative to record the way things work, the brutal realities. But more importantly, he allocates praise and blame and keeps alive the awareness of what constitutes good behavior. He's a moral guide through stories.
Like Sima Qian, the historian who chose truth over power.
Exactly, telling the moral truth. The novel even shows the negative. Killing a historian to stop a sympathetic view of a tyrant. It shows the power and danger of truth-telling.
So Lo tells us not only how the world is, but he also shows us goodness and villainy, and compels us to admire goodness, even when it fails.
His ultimate goal isn't depression, but inspiration. To inspire us to goodness, despite its utility. We can't demand moral courage, he implies, but we shouldn't withhold admiration when we see it.
Regardless whether we share the values he's being courageous about.
It's an enduring call to moral strength, even facing those inevitable cycles of chaos.
Wow, we've just navigated a really complex, dense, often challenging deep dive, exploring how popular Chinese political culture, especially through the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Moody's analysis, offers this rich, respectable political theory.
With sharp empirical observations about power, but also profound moral components.
And these aren't just ancient Chinese ideas, are they? They speak to universal truths about the human condition, leadership, our whole view on political action.
This theory really illuminates politics in general. It describes a world not that different from what Thomas Hobbes described, life in a state of nature being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Where conflict is raw and unchecked when order breaks down.
It reminds us that stable political order needs both moral consensus and force. Force alone, without shared values, is tyranny or just fragile peace.
But consensus alone isn't enough against human ambition and self-interest.
And the breakdown of one often leads to the collapse of the other, plunging societies into luan, that insecurity, violence, anarchy, where politics becomes a pure battle for power, limited only by prudence and expediency.
We've seen how periods of luan, ancient warring states in China, early feudalism in Europe or Japan, maybe even parts of our own world today.
They're characterized by this political pathology, and how, when order is missing, thinking about politics often gets a highly authoritarian tone. Order becomes the top priority, even if other values suffer.
Which leaves us with this really critical question, building on Moody's insight. We want not only order, but also other values for which order is a prerequisite, but which order may also destroy.
That's the rub.
The problem is to generate a she which permits a decent life. What does that mean for you listening now? As you watch the world, think about leaders. Navigate your own life.
How do we build a world where the things we need for order don't end up crushing the very values, loyalty, honor, decency, justice that order was supposed to protect in the first place?
That is definitely something to mull over as you reflect on the forces shaping your life and the world around you.